The Art of Yes. Interview with Michael Golding. Hello, Michael. Today, my
Hello.
guest is Michael Golding, teacher, improviser from United States. Welcome to The Art of Yes, Michael.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
How are you? How are you these days?
I'm doing okay. I found a way to survive during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And even though teaching improv workshops online is a different experience, it's been rewarding. I've been learning a lot and reinventing myself in a way.
Mhm. So it's like doing something new finally after years of doing
Yeah, yeah.
that job.
And it's going to be pretty weird when I do go back in person because then it's going to be a question of what can I do, keeping in mind we have to distance and probably still wear masks. And so much of my repertoire, particularly bowling games, are based on physical touch. So this is going to be interesting, the return.
Hmm. Yeah. Welcome to my podcast or video podcast. I'm really glad to have you because you're one of the people who are so long in improv that a part of your experience, you have also huge knowledge. And for those who don't know you, will go probably later through things you know because you are having an archives of David Shepard and a lot of other stuff. And you've been in improv so long that your experience is really great in case of like knowledge of, and history of improv. But I usually start, and this time will be the same. I will start this interview about you because I want to know how did you start improvisation? And as far as I know, your beginning is a little bit different. That's what I know from the movie you made. So I want to hear that story because I heard this story from different parts, a little bit here, a little bit there. But I'd like to hear how that happened. And this young boy was calling some station and end up doing improv over 40 years, right?
Yeah, since I was 14, and I kind of fell into it. I had a crush on this redheaded girl named Sandy when I was 14, and I actually got close to her brother, who was a huge fan of old time radio shows, and he got me kind of addicted to it. I would go over to visit her, supposedly, but then I would end up hanging with him, listening to these old time radio shows. And he told me they were being broadcast regularly on a New York local station. And on Saturday nights at midnight, WRVR radio in New York would play The Shadow. And it was wonderful to listen to that late at night at 14. But during the commercials, there was a commercial for a show called The Responsive Scene, which the tagline really intrigued me. The tagline was, "You provide the audio, we will provide the video." And the concept of the show was there was a bunch of improv actors in the studio. The listening audience would call in with scene suggestions, and the actors would play it out right there live on the radio.
Mhm.
And I thought this was wonderful. So I listened in for a couple of weeks, pretty much figured out how it worked. And I got up the courage to call in with my own scene idea, which was about a pizza boy delivering a pizza to the wrong address. And the host of the show asked me, "Do you want to play the delivery boy?" And I went, "Sure, why not? I'm feeling brave." And that was my first improv experience. And I became a regular caller for the rest of the summer. Sometimes scene suggestions, other times I would play, sometimes I would direct. I got my friends involved too. So we, at least five of us, were calling every week. And when the show ended at the end of the summer, the producer of the show called me. His name was David Shepard. Had no idea who he was. And David told me he was putting together a new format and he would like me and my friends to be involved in that format. The format was called no, excuse me, the Improv Olympics, and David felt there should be a team of teenagers playing in the Improv Olympics along with the adults, and that started my long journey with David Shepard. Um, to me, he was just a cool man who liked to play, and all his friends around him were the same way. They treated me like I was an adult. And from 1972 until David's passing in December of 2018, I was either directly involved or a consultant on every single one of his formats since then. We became incredibly close. It was kind of like a mentor student relationship in the beginning, maybe a little father son thing thrown in, and somehow along the way we became contemporaries. But then towards the end, I kind of played a caregiving role with him.
Mhm, mhm,
And the last few years of his life, he gave me his improv collection, and I was thinking, what the hell am I going to do with all of this stuff? And I put it all together and donated to Northwestern University in Chicago, which was suggested to me by Aretha Sills. That's where Viola Spolin and Paul Sills' papers are.
mhm.
So that's a short, long answer of how it started. A phone call in New York City started the journey.
But it's interesting for me that you recorded it, and this is in the movie. And it took me a while to register that this is you and this is about you. This call in the movie about David, which we will mention, or I will put links later under this video. So, how did you have this idea? Did you have this idea to record, and why did you do that? And did you think it was such a meaningful thing in your life at that point?
Well, I was in the habit of recording the old time radio shows.
Okay.
So this was just an addition to it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there was no value to it other than it was cool to hear my voice on the radio, to hear my name on the radio. Sometimes when my friends and I would call in with different scenes, we would use each other's names as characters. Uh, David actually told me years later, you and your friends were pain in the asses. You turned the show into a show about teenagers. Uh, for David, the responsive scene was a show about being responsive to the needs of the community, hoping people will call in with suggestions about problems in their lives, and it would be worked out through role playing on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
My friends and I turned it into something different. So, um, and I held on to it. You know, I transferred the tapes to CDs, and it was just an afterthought when we were putting together the documentary. I have me calling in for the first time. And yeah, it for a lot of people who watch the documentary, it doesn't clue in right away that that's me on the call.
That's
Uh,
true. I'm the good example of that.
for me, it's kind of alien because I'm sure I still have a New York accent, but my God, was that a thick New York accent I was listening to? A little 14-year-old boy from Flushing, Queens, with the fear all the time that a member of my family would suddenly get on the phone during the recording. Like, what's going on here? How long are you on the phone for?
Yeah. But I have to say that when I listen to it, it sounds to me like you had from very, very beginning great sense of comedy and rising the stakes and like um, really, really improviser soul and actors and like you felt it.
Well, thank you for that. A lot of it was, to me, the concept of the show was very simple, very direct, because it was come up with a scene. Here's the structure: who, what, where. Who is in the scene? Usually two people. What is the scene about? What is happening? Where does the scene take place? Go. And usually during the week leading up to the show, I would go through different scene ideas in my head about what I was going to call in that week. And I thought directing was very direct, just say freeze and then take it back in time, forward in time, change location, character, emotion. This just seemed really simple to me. And to this day, myself and the host of the show, Howard Jerome, who I hope we talk a little bit more about, he was David's partner who created the Improv Olympics. Howard and I always talk about this is such a beautiful, simple concept. Why isn't it being done all over the world? Why isn't every radio station, every city, every country doing it? And I'm surprised. Every time I try to do the responsive scene, it always goes in a different direction. The people I'm working with usually want to go for surreal characters and exaggerated emotions. And when they come up with the who, what, where scene, they try to make it funny in the concept.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
and I'm always trying to push for play yourself, play someone from your life. Let's explore. It's called responsive scene. So like Howard said, it should be done. More people should be doing it. It's not us who are going to keep it going. I
Yeah.
occasionally use it with my class.
Yeah, but the setup of this scene, because it was made by you, right? That the boy or there's a pizza delivery, and you come to the house, and the lady is really hungry, but she didn't order it. It's already like a premise of the scene, and then you keep going with that, and that's great. So it's really, it's not about, like as you said, having something funny, but you had really a comedy premise in this already, in this being 14 years old boy who just presented ready sketch, which
You
was
know, it's interesting because in my head, when I was trying to figure out what made this show work, other than the simplicity of the concept, it was clear to me that I had to listen harder than usual when I was on these calls, so I can pick up little pieces of information that the players were giving me. And in that pizza scene, when I ask for money for the pizza, and the woman tells me no. If my husband ordered it, he already paid for it. So we go right into, the argument, and and then the pizza falls on the floor, and boom, scene is over. So it was a lovely give and take. Um, in fact, I can tell you a quick, wonderful story about that scene. Years ago, we had a 90th birthday celebration for David in Western Massachusetts 6 months before his actual 90th birthday because his doctors were telling us he wasn't going to make it to the end of the year. The last few years of David's life, we got that warning a lot. David actually lived to 94. But at the celebration, one of the original performers from the responsive scene was there. Her name was Lynn Burnfield. And we were talking, and when I brought up the pizza delivery scene, she was the one who played it with me. So it was just a whoa, 40 years later. And
amazing. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you who was that woman, and you see,
Lynn,
read
Lynn
you read
Burfield,
my mind.
still performing, still singing, still improvising. And yeah, it was interesting that I spent the summer listening to all these voices, and I had a specific image in my head how they looked, and most of them kind of segued over to the Improv Olympics and some of the teams, and none of them looked like the way I envisioned them. Not one. So yeah, it was pretty wild. Uh, I was exactly what they thought I would be, some skinny 14-year-old kid from
Mhm.
Flushing, Queens. So I was enormously lucky to have a childhood like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me what happened, like how you remember your beginning then, because David called you, and then what happened, because you're doing it 40 years, so that means, or over 40 years, that means that something happened that you were involved in it, and it became your job. So how this whole happened at the beginning? Do you remember your first days, first workshops, first working with David, and how that was?
all of it is happenstance, chance, and sheer luck. Throughout middle school and high school, I was doing the Improv Olympics with David. We had matches in different boroughs in New York. I had matches in my own high school. Um, Once I segued into college, I kind of still continued doing that, but then David started doing other formats. He had this wonderful loft downtown, the South Seaport area, and I was part of that group. We were consistently doing workshops on the Improv Olympics, sometimes compass scenario workshops. But one day, David just told me, I can't be around to teach this workshop at 11 o'clock at the loft. Why don't you do it? And
Mhm.
I'd never taught a workshop before, but I figured, well, I know how it works. We always do a group warm up, then we do technique work, and then some formats, then we do scenes, and sure. And it just felt very natural to me. And that was my first official workshop in that loft. But when I was working with my team all through middle school and high school, we would all take turns
Mhm.
rehearsals leading workshops. But I always wanted to be a director on top of a writer and actor, and it just felt natural. And towards the end of the 70s, um, David's format was adapted in Canada. First, it was called the Canadian Improv Olympics, but then it became the Canadian Improv Games because the Olympic Committee came after them. But I became friends with people doing the games in Ottawa. Willie Wiley, really important person, uh, got me to move to Ottawa in the early 80s. And for 2 years, I was doing the Canadian Improv Games, but at the same time, I ended up working on this program through Planned Parenthood called the Insight Theater Company, which was a series of unresolved scenes about teen concern, drugs, peer pressure, dating. That was almost kind of like my compass. And somehow I started developing this niche as a person who works with at risk teens. And I'm doing that in Ottawa, and David's in Chicago doing the Improv Olympics on a greater scale. That's when he hooked up with Shauna Halpern. Um, I'm jumping around a lot, so I want to backtrack a little bit with my upbringing. Um, in the beginning with the improv world, it was me, David Shepard, and Howard Jerome, David's partner. And then in 1974, Howard moved to Toronto. And that's where he first introduced the Improv Olympics there. And then Howard moved to Ottawa and started teaching improv in the high schools and found his Canadian version of Michael Golding, who was Willie Wiley. And Willie had a bunch of friends, and they had a theater group called Stage Fright. My improv group was called Fool's Paradise. So Howard became the coach for Stage Fright. They performed in the Improv Olympics in Toronto in 74. And then around 76, Willie and his friends decided they wanted to give something back. So in 1977, the Canadian Improv Games was born. And Howard told Willie, if we're going to be doing the Improv Olympics based on David's work, we need to bring up David and his sidekick, Michael Golding. Willie and I hit it off right away. So, in improv folklore, Howard and David were the first two, but then David and I were kind of like father son. Howard had a father son thing going with David too, but then Howard had a father son thing going with Willie. Then Willie and I became super close friends, and we had like a brother thing going. But for close to 40 years, me, David, Willie, and Howard did some extraordinary things together. And sadly, Howard and I are the last two standing of this improv quartet. Uh, we've sometimes been called the Beatles of improv.
Oh, yeah. Great name, and I understand why.
But I always thought that improv was always like a temporary thing. I never sat down and went, I'm going to have a career in improvisation. David and Paul Sills always felt that was my path. And I think it was also kind of responsible for me for drifting away from David for a brief period. Because as I was approaching graduation from college, David and Paul Sills pretty much mapped out my life for me, saying that you're going to move to Chicago and you're going to take workshops at Second City. How am I going to make a living? You'll work as a dishwasher or sling hash. Where am I going to live? We'll find you an apartment. You'll be in the touring company for a while. Then maybe you'll do that. They pretty much mapped out my life. I wasn't crazy about that. Plus, I had a little falling out with David, which we'll talk about at one point because that's important too about improv. So Willie went, why don't you come to Ottawa and spread your wings? And little did I realize it was going to enhance my improv repertoire and work with teenagers.
Mhm. So, do you remember from the beginning, from doing improv at the beginning, like kind of things like, oh, that's exciting, that's easy, that's not easy? What was like for you super easy and fun, and where did you find kind of challenges, or what was not that easy for a young boy doing improv?
Well, the thing that appealed to me was playing people that I know well. David and Howard changed my perspective on how to do characters right away. When they first met me, my idea of doing characters was playing, Groucho Marx. But David would go, "Why don't you play your father in this scene?" And it's like, all right, that's an interesting thing. Or why don't you play your mother? Why don't you play your brother or a teacher? So that I found easy to do. Um, Also, focusing on space work, that I was always very, very inspired by to approach a scene not with, well, what am I going to say as this character when I jump in, but what am I going to do? How am I going to explore this place? What can I find and handle, and how will that affect me emotionally? And how will I express that emotion through the activity of, drinking a simple cup of coffee? I remember at first I thought David was being a jerk, but I'm drinking a cup of coffee and the scene goes, freeze! I don't believe you drinking coffee. It's like, what are you, I don't believe you. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it sour? Is it this? Is it bitter? Okay, it's bitter. I took a sip. I don't believe you. It's bitter. How is it affecting your stomach? How does it make you walk? I'm like, get off my case, old man. It's And God forbid you were in a scene with David Shepard and you walk through an object he created. He'll stop the scene right then and there. This asshole just walked through my refrigerator. Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. You didn't see it because you weren't paying attention. Whoa, okay, got it. Which is which is fascinating. In Jeffrey Sweet's book, Something Wonderful Right Away, everyone is talking about this incredible temper Paul Sills had, how he yelled at people, threw chairs at people. I never experienced that with Paul. He was always warm and loving and supportive with me. David had a temper. It was always through improv, but he had a temper and he would explode. Um, I can't remember much that I was having a problem with. Um, Actually, sometimes David would like to explore a scene using a well-known legend or a myth, like the myth of Saint Valentine, Legend of Saint Valentine. And I would say, well, I don't know about Saint Valentine other than boxes of chocolates and stuff. You don't know about Saint Valentine? What do they teach you in schools? And then that would, force me to read up. And so I would, David was the one thing that was clear for me from the start, this was an extraordinarily intelligent man, and if you didn't have the same frame of reference that he had, he let you know about it and made you force yourself. Um, I think in the beginning, what I had problems with was being emotionally sincere. I David and Howard's early memories of me was uptight was a word they used a lot. That I held my emotions in,
Mm-hmm.
and a breakthrough I had, God, wasn't until I was in my teens. I was in one of David's last Compass shows, and one of the scenes I was in was with a woman who was coming on to me, and I was supposed to be intimidated by it, threatened, scared. But the actress I was playing with, I was actually very much attracted to. So it was not sincere to David my revulsion. So he put me in this. He replaced the actress with someone who I was actually very intimidated by, and he gave her extra direction to really go after him. So my emotion then was sincere. So to this day, it's still hard to separate some performers from the characters they're playing. But in that moment, I was really afraid and really repulsed and wanted to get the hell out of there because David put me in a scene with someone I was intimidated by. So I like to think I'm more emotionally open when I play because I'm certainly going after my players with emotional sincerity. But there was a time when I blocked it, and my emotional responses were more verbal than physical.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so yeah, it's
So did you have like kind of acting experience, like school or college? What happened
yes.
next?
I went to NYU, Tisch School of the Arts, undergraduate drama. I'm so old. At the time, it was called School of the Arts, not Tisch. Tisch brothers haven't made their donation yet. It was a wonderful program that, in the 124 credits you needed to graduate, 64 was in liberal arts. The other 64 was in acting, but you had a choice of an acting school to go to study. And the choices were the Lee Strasberg Theater Institute, Experimental Theater Wing, Circle in the Square, Stella Adler. For no reason other than I saw a documentary about Lee Strasberg. I took the Lee Strasberg Theater Institute and studied there extensively for 3 years, a sense memory and emotional recall and doing scenes and private moments. And what was interesting was we did a lot of improvisations in class, but it was improvisations to explore character or explore a scenario, and we would never get more than you're coming home after being away from war for 2 years, but your family members don't know you're blind yet. Okay, let's play that scene. Um, I remember with one particular acting teacher who wanted to find out if we had other acting influences other than Strasberg. I raised my hand and talked about improv. And I thought it was interesting that when I mentioned we do a lot of Spolin games, um, the teacher got very dismissive. He went, "Oh, those are children's games, right?" And then he started going on about, I'm sure there's some value and all that kind of stuff. So I challenged him and said, no, actually, they're, human based. And so, all right, why don't you come up here, smart ass, and demonstrate some of the games? So I did contact with two students where you're having a conversation, but you have to touch the other person differently every time you say something. And that brings out an emotional reality. Afterwards, a teacher did tell me he was fascinated by that, and he had no clue. To him, he said he never read Improv, the theater, Spolin's book, but to him, Yeah, it was just children's games. So
Mhm.
I I like to think my technique is a combination of shepherd and the method, but also I studied. I have a master's in educational theater with a focus on drama therapy. So there's a combination of that too. And what was interesting when I was taking drama therapy courses, a lot of the techniques they would use, they were called by different names, but I'm sitting there going, that's a Spolin game. That's Shepard. No, that's Paul Sills. Oh, that's a Keith Johnstone game you're ripping off. And yeah, it was really interesting. And
That's
really, if you look at all the practitioners, they were experimenting with applied improv, therapy, sociodrama way before now.
mhm.
So yeah, I have a pretty good background, not just David. Um, Although it's interesting that in my advanced years, I'm still learning new stuff. I took a few of Jeff Matowski's workshops, and I told him that opened my mind with how to approach improv because with David and Paul, the way they trained me was you know the who, what, where before you jump on the scene.
Yes.
So you got that knowledge. With Jeff, he throws two actors up on stage. You discover it right then, where you're looking at each other, and I perceive anguish, I perceive suspicion, and I told Jeff that's 1,000 times harder. And yeah, really listening, really paying attention. But and I think that's why I fell into it with David's work in the beginning because there was always a structure, a specific structure and guidelines. And I carry this over with the way I teach. As long as you focus on the guidelines and the structure, everything else, will come. My students, how can I make this scene interesting? How can I make it funny? What can I say? Just the objective of this game is to touch when you say each other. Just just focus on that.
Yeah, that's how I Viola was how Viola was teaching, right? That she was teaching, giving that, serving that to children, and letting them not to think where they are, who they are, and just playing emotionally, and then later on they could discover that when they got the skills.
Yeah, especially when she would do scenes where you would just see the feet of the performers. The curtain would be down that low, and when David was experimenting with developing video movies through improvisation, if he was shooting a scene, suddenly he would be focusing on people's hands or someone's foot or elbow, and it always made me laugh. Like that's what you find interesting in this scene right now.
Hmm.
But yeah, that was David, and I find with the stuff I learned away from David, I was always trying to make him aware of educational theater and drama therapy. He found a lot of the work of British improvisers kind of dry. Um, I was with him in Toronto when we saw a performance of theater sports, but it was a version where the actors were openly mocked on stage. One actor screwed up in the scene, so he had to wear a dunce cap and sit in the corner. And another one got sprayed by a seltzer bottle.
Hmm.
David was horrified by that. Um, Although it's kind of interesting that in the early 70s, several forms of competitive improv were developing simultaneously: improv Olympics, theater sports, comedy sports, but none of them were aware of each other.
Let's
So,
go to that in the moment, but I still wanted to ask you something because I want to have a little bit of you more, like because later I will go to David and the history of improv a little bit
okay.
with you, but because we're still at Michael's improv life, so I would ask you. I would like to ask you about a few things which I just found like today. One is I wanted to ask you, what's the player's contract?
Oh, the player's contract It actually evolved into the oath for the Canadian Improv Games. But if I remember from memory, the oath was you have to be in the moment, you have to support the other player.
I wrote it down so I can like recall this,
Sure.
because it was like a player's contract, and when I play I shall do, and then was things you should do. So I should do something what people will enjoy watching. That was one thing. I shall do accept. I shall listen, not hurt anyone physically. I shall be real as possible, honest, and I shall give others a chance to play.
Yeah, that goes back to the simplicity of these formats. David was telling me that player contract I think came from one of the programs for the Improv Olympics, and this is what I find interesting about when people talk about the rules of improv now. Usually, you'll see me pop in on certain Facebook pages where people are going through long, lengthy descriptions of the rules, and I come in with short, one-line sentences. The thing about being real, um, that's from David and Paul. To them, it was so simple. Don't go on doing stupid characters, accents. Be yourself. Be real. Um, the thing about agreement, if someone says your name is Bob, you're Bob. I guess that's the foundation, maybe, of yes and.
Yes.
Uh, for me, it was always improv is all based on agreement. Do not deny. So that was pretty clear. This work is always supposed to be a collaboration, between individuals or a group. And yeah, those are the player's contract is really simple. We would sometimes say that before a match where, okay, let's go through the player's oath. It turned into now what they do with the Canadian Improv Games is usually Howard Jerome, he's known as Old Man Improv. The Canadian Improv Game oath is we have come together in the spirit of loving competition to celebrate the Canadian Improv Games. Here comes the rules. We promise to uphold the ideals of improvisation, to support one another, to learn from each other, to keep ourselves in the moment, and above all, have a good time. So that's the oral oath that they give before the Canadian Pro Games, which is it's a player's contract.
Yeah.
But again, it's when I go through the rules of improvisation, don't deny, be real, explore objects. There you go. Let's go. Let's play. And it's
So you and your team, did you use that in your before your shows, or with some other people, or mainly because of the Improv Olympics?
sometimes before an improv Olympic show with my team, Fool's Paradise, yes, we would go through that player's contract. The Olympics evolved a lot. Usually during the first half of the show, it was just the teams playing each other. In the second half, we would get audience members to come up and play with us. But we would give them the guidelines like, okay, if you're going to come up and play with us, this is all we ask. Be real, be yourself. We just want to see who you are. Don't deny, and let's try to use imaginary objects as much as possible. Okay, let's go. It was,
Yeah.
that simple. Because that started with Compass. It seems like the more I talk about myself, I go back to David. But
Yeah. Yeah, but I still keep you there. Like I still keep you at Michael's life. Because I know we will go there, because it's such a big part of your experience life, and you were so connected to him that I hear that in every talk of yours. But also that's why I want to keep a little bit grounded in your life, because it's easy to escape to his life and history of improv, which we will do in a moment. uh, but I want to keep you still in your life.
well, it's interesting that there was a time when I had to separate from David and establish my own improv identity. And it's almost like Leonard Nimoy for years was saying, "I'm not Spock, I'm not Spock," and then at one point he accepted it and went, "Okay, I am Spock." And for me, it was improv is kind of like the mafia. Every time I think I'm out, I get dragged back in. And I started to resent, not so much resent David, but before I moved to Canada and kind of established my own improv identity, David would always introduce me as, "This is Michael Golding, one of my oldest students." And at that point, I was writing and directing my own shows at NYU. I started teaching my own workshops. And I'm like, "Could you maybe introduce me as Michael Golding, your friend or someone I worked with?" And around 81, when David was invited to go to Chicago to work on the Improv Olympics, he wanted me to go with him, as did Paul. But I had that offer from Willie, and it's, yeah, I'm going to go up there and do my thing. Although I still had the specter of David over me because doing the Canadian Improv Olympics, well, that's kind of like David's Improv Olympics or Second City. And then when I did the Insight Theater Company with Planned Parenthood, well, that was kind of like Compass for teenagers. So I still kind of had a little David attached to me. Um, but developing a reputation as working with at-risk populations, that happened gradually over a 20, 30-year period. But when I look back, it's, well, I guess I was kind of doing that with David in the 70s too, because other teams we worked with were from economically depressed areas.
Mhm.
So, and as I jump around, I'm always amazed by the accusations of all the improv companies in the United States of, misogyny, racism. And from the second I worked with David, all the groups we worked with were always racially mixed, always. When I
Mhm.
was doing the Improv Olympics, Hispanic teams, Black teams, Asian teams, always mixed. Um, Although he was always critical of Ottawa, like, "I don't see any Black people." It's like, well, there's not a lot of Black people in really white Ottawa. Although,
Mhm.
yeah, there should be French speaking teams.
Yeah.
Um,
So
now I
how
look.
so how was it for you to start new, like, being there and starting? What happened then? Because let's go to what you're doing now, because that rise you're as a teacher who is involved in teenagers education, but very specific, I think, and you use improv as a applied improv for teaching them. So tell me, how was it for you at the beginning to start your own identity, and how it evolved till now? What you're doing now?
Okay, well, about 20 years ago, a little bit more, 21 years ago, I originally came out here in 92 from New York as a writer. And I had one of those writing careers where I got paid a lot of money for projects that never saw the light of day. Um, and I ended up taking a teaching position at Los Angeles City College in 2000. They had a high school outreach program where high school students would take a college course, get credit for it, and hopefully maybe go to that college when they graduate high school. But regardless, the credits would be transferred. And the course I was hired to teach was Intro to Acting. And I had this wonderful group of students at a school called the Downtown Business Magnet. It was one of the rare perfect opportunities because when I usually teach high school outreach programs with my colleges, the courses are usually at the end of the school day. So the students are already exhausted. I got to find a way to get their energy up. This first class I taught was in the morning. So it was wonderful. Um, all the stuff I had in mind for intro to acting, monologues and scenes, I ran through all that stuff really quickly. And then I realized I I have all these theater games I could use. And I managed to turn that class into an ensemble. And I was, at the time, I told my then wife that I'm giving them everything I have learned up to this point in my life. And it was very specific. We began with a morning warm up, did some techniques, some formats, and then scenes. And I trained them so well that I decided, well, I should take more of an improv approach to this. Maybe I'll have them take turns leading the warm up. So they were doing that. One day, the school screwed up. Students had to be tested, so they moved the time of my class. The students realized I probably wasn't notified, so they led the entire class themselves uh, without me.
Mhm.
Um, but as I was experimenting with all these formats, I realized all this stuff works. And I had this endorphin rush every time I would end a workshop, which I hadn't had in a long time. And as the writing work began to shrink, the teaching work began to increase. I ended up working for another college. Same thing, they have a high school outreach program. The courses would usually go from 3:30 to 5:30. But this time it was theater appreciation. And I realized pretty quickly I'm not going to be able to teach this course by just lecturing to at risk teenagers. I have to find a way to make it interactive. So everything in the curriculum that I had to approach, writing, acting, directing, I was able to find a theater game for them to do it. And they ended up learning way more in the course than if I gave them assignments, they wrote papers, they handed it to me. And every group would be come with its own set of problems. Like I would have one group that's 40 students. What am I going to do with 40 students for an hour and a half, 2 hours after the group warm up? And then I can break them up into groups of 4 or 5 and give them an assignment, like an event from the Improv Olympics. Okay, this group, you got to come up with a theme. Could be any kind of theme. Then give me 3 locations where you can explore it. So they would have to collaborate and kind of make an outline of an improv scene. And then the last half hour, 45 minutes of the class, each group would go one by one, and I would watch a series of scenes around a theme. And we just did a long form show. So
Amazing.
it was constantly balancing. Um, Although I'm always fighting the schools I work with. If I tell them, oh, I'm using improvisation to teach my course, to them, oh, you're teaching them how to be comedians. But if I say theater games or theater formats or theater structures, yeah, that they'll grasp onto. Um, it kind of amazes me that I probably have worked with hundreds, thousands of students at this point in my life.
Mhm.
But every semester is shaky. Like I usually get 2, 3 courses per semester, but because of the pandemic, we're down to just one. Not many of my at risk students have access to the internet. And those that do, now they don't have to just go to our college, Compton College. They can go to other colleges and not leave their bedroom.
Mhm.
So, but it is rewarding. And every once in a while, I have to remind myself that this may be the millionth time I'm doing this structure with this group, but it's the first time for them.
Mhm.
So the more I do it, the more I have to keep on top of my patience. I have to
Mhm.
keep on top of my own listening skills. But everything kind of changed 15 years ago when more students started coming in with cell phones. And I discovered pretty quickly that's killing empathy with them. It's diminishing their interpersonal skills. Most of my students text, they don't talk on the phone. And when I ask them, it's because speaking is uncomfortable and there's pauses and, yeah, losing the nuance of
Mm-hmm.
conversation. Uh, when I would first work with at-risk teenagers, they would just talk too much on stage, and now it's I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, so I have to push a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's it's scary in a way.
So what is for you rewarding in this job and teaching teens, and what do you take from that and what do you take from them?
Uh, what's rewarding is that if I can get a student to look at themselves differently, then and that their story matters. I try to make my workshops as much about the students as possible. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if any character has to be someone they know, any theme has to be something they have expressed. If there's a problem that has to be worked out, it should be a problem they can relate to. Um, Still, the simple statement, that was fun, can really give me an enormous feeling. Usually at the end of a workshop. I'm trying to give my students a little bit of hope too that there's light beyond this pandemic. The pandemic has been a central theme, but usually in the beginning of the semester, my classes are mixed, but mm, the black students might hang with themselves, the Hispanic, but slowly everyone begins to intermingle. In the beginning, I'll let them choose who they want to work with, but then I make the point of, yeah, sometimes when you're sitting down and working with someone you're not focusing on the task, you're gossiping. So then I'll start putting them in with people they don't know, and then friendships develop,
Mm-hmm.
which is wonderful. So I don't consciously walk into a workshop with this is what I'm going to accomplish with these people today. I usually have, in the real world, I used to have little index cards on me, plan A, plan B on the back, but very much playing the moment. If there's a warm up game that they're really into and they want to spend the entire 90 minutes or more on that game, sure. Why don't we do that?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of my students don't want to be there. Uh, they have to either take theater as a requirement, but it's late in the day. They don't want to be actors, writers, or directors. So, what I'm always trying to get through to them is that I don't expect you to become professional writers, actors, or directors, but these are life skills. These are people skills.
Mm-hmm.
And for this group I'm working with right now, and I'm getting great feedback from them. Whenever we have to explore something like, all right, today's lecture is going to be not really a lecture, is going to be on elements of theater. We need to know all the components that make up a theatrical production. But instead of me standing here and telling you about that, I'm going to send you guys to breakout rooms for a few minutes. Come up with your own list with what you think are the important elements of a theatrical production. My little subtext is you already have the knowledge, you just don't know it. And that's how it gives them a little more confidence. So it's it's getting harder every time. I love playing with them too, but sometimes they don't get the format, but they'll volunteer anyway, even though I'm always going. But this next exercise, only volunteer if you know exactly what I'm asking. Here it is. Get the volunteers in. Yeah, you weren't.
Do you still play, like playing with, I don't know, on the stage with people or probably with teenagers sometimes, but do you still play?
Yeah, I'm trying to do more now than I used to. When I would play with my students, um, it was always in some kind of authority role. Like I would play the teacher, I would play a parent, a therapist. Uh, Once in a while, my students would try to, all right, we're going to do a scene where you're going out on a date with her, and I go, yeah, that's not going to happen. So let's come up with another scene idea. Although when I spent a year, which is one of the rare experiences I had where I was actually hired based on my background was when I was on the faculty of this all-girl charter school for 1 year. They wanted a theater person who had experience working with at-risk individuals, but they wanted someone who could be focused on the process, not so much the end result, knowing that these theater skills will help their interpersonal skills.
Mm-hmm.
So I would play roles with them a lot, but because of their backgrounds and their at risk, uh, I was asked to play a transsexual a few times. Sure. Drug dealer. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Police officer. Things like that. But it's hard because when I'm playing with my students, part of my brain is kind of that third eye watching everything around me because I'm trying to make them look as good as possible, but I'm trying to be aware of what's going on with the class. So I feel like my playing ability is a little diminished.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I have a Saturday workshop, which I do mostly as an audio experience, and sometimes I play, but still it's hard having that. I'm half in, I'm half out. That's why it was wonderful doing Jeff's workshop. Um, and there are other people who want me to join their online workshops, which I might start doing more. Um, I found that when I play, I'm really more into role playing. Just give me the situation. Who are we? Let's get into it. Um, Although I enjoy games like one word story or use 2 words or 3 words at a time, guess who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I find myself sometimes not doing well. My brain disconnects. I just want to play. Tell me who I am. Who are you? What the hell is going on? Let's do it. If you want to side coach me with, all right, just do gibberish, just do pantomime. That's great. But yeah, it's hard. Um, in fact, about a year ago, at the Fanatic Salon,
Mm-hmm.
Jeff's Theater, we had a stage reading of the book Ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
And I was initially flattered that I was asked to be with this amazing cast to read from it, where I actually had to be 7 different well known people. Um, and then I was scared to death that I'm going to be on stage with all these people not really performing for so long. But it was interesting. The approach I took was more method than improv, where every single person I read, I'm going through the lines that can I find something here that relates to my reality so I can say this organically.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like when Marty Kaz is talking about his father, Fred Kaz, who was a pianist at Second City, but felt he never got his due and wasn't really well known. And I read the part of Marty, but that resonated with me because, oh yeah, that's how I felt about David. Never got his due. Sure, I can do that. So the classical acting came back, and it was interesting. Some of the people who saw the show were, how come you're not acting anymore? And I was actually toying with the idea of, well, maybe I'll investigate that after many years of not, and then the world shut down. So
But it will be back soon. I hope that you will come back on the stage and just doing improv in live with people and just performing and just being back to it.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I found when I improvise and play with groups, I always enjoy working with people I know. Um, Years ago, I was hired by a theater company to do a private workshop once a week on a Friday night, and but they did lousy advertising, so they told me the space is yours for 8 weeks. This is during the summer, so maybe you can develop a following. What I ended up doing was, I'm a cyclist, And one of the cycling groups I ride with, I went, hey, why don't we try this on Friday nights? A different side to our relationship when we only see each other on our bikes. Some had a performing background, some didn't. But for 8 weeks, it was wonderful, where we got together and we played games, and I facilitated the workshop. And then we would go off and have dinner afterwards, talking about what we did. And it brought back to me the important social aspects of improv. Instead of just hanging out in a room with some people getting drunk, why don't you go play some games for a while? Then you can go out and get drunk. So,
But that all brings me because I see that in your work, and I think that what you're doing now is such a big reflection what David was doing, and that somehow it it was to him important to work with people and give this humanity to young people. So I think that's a great point to now switch from Michael, the improviser and teacher, to Michael, a friend and archivist of David's work, and also you know a lot of stories about improv history, which is uh, very wide, but you know a lot. So I want to go through that a little bit now.
I was there for so much of it. It's interesting. The pandemic has forced me to revisit a lot of David's concepts and philosophy. Going back to David felt that games are what we should always be doing. They are benign. They are beautiful. We should all be playing at home. I started this with my summer class because an ongoing theme with my students was that they're on top of their family, their friends, they're going nuts. So I came up with an assignment where they had to play a theater game with one of their family members or friends. If they're okay, record it, play it back in class, and then tell me what you learned about that person through playing the game. And I gave them a simple concept. It's David's repetition poem format, where you improvise a poem where you just pitch to the person a repetition that begins each line of your poem. It could be as simple as, why can't I? And the emotion beneath it could be frustration. And I encourage the players, you can do as many lines as you want, but at least five. And it could be, why can't I go out? Why can't I see my friends? Why can't I make dinner? Why can't I hug you? Why can't I see you? Period. You just improvised the poem. So I would get the students to, based on what you know about that person, make the repetition a little personal and see what you get. And to me, that's David. Your assignment is to play with someone, and
Mhm.
and that's pretty wonderful for me.
So
Uh,
I would like you because I know that first of all in America, David is more known than in Europe or other places. But also, even in America, he's not recognized that well, like I think he should be. Especially
Absolutely.
that when we talk about improvisation, most of the people will know about Viola and Dell, and the biggest improv schools which were existing. Some of them are already not existing anymore in Chicago or other places all over the states and Canada. So um, as well as Joe Forsberg and some other people, I think that David is not that much recognized, and not many people know that he had such a big influence. First of all, on Compass and the beginning of improvisation, and later IO and also other stuff. So, can you like make a short summary of David, and then we will go through things he did and go deeper.
Okay. I like to think David's a little bit better known now than he was a few years ago, and that I had a small part in that. And
I think big
what?
part.
Thank you. In fact, one of the more beautiful moments between me and David towards the end of his life is he acknowledged that he is more known than he thought, and that he had made a contribution to American theater. So a short, quick
Like,
rundown of David.
or let's say the introduction, and then we will go deeper with everything what you want to say, and maybe I will have some more questions. But
Well, I guess David is kind of considered the father of modern day improvisation, although he would say, correct people and say he's the uncle.
yeah,
Um, but he always had a dream that he wanted to have a people's theater. He wanted to see what was going on in the audience reflected on stage. He felt that theater, when he was in his 20s, was about people in evening gowns talking about issues you can't relate to. He tried a couple of repertory companies on his own, which didn't really work. His first theater format was called Rolling Stage, which was literally a stage that rolled out, going from city to city, doing performances of Moliere's Miser. Didn't really work. He hitchhiked to Chicago, and there he encountered Paul Sills, and they got together to talk about their visions of a popular theater. So they had kind of an agreement. If David, who had this inheritance from his stepmother, would use his resources to fund Playwrights Theater Club. It was a repertory group that Paul Sills created and David became a co-producer of. If David did that, the next thing they would do would be Compass, which was David's vision of a popular theater. The majority of the people who were involved in Playwrights Theater Club, who did something like 35 classical plays in 2 years, Ed Asner, Barbara Harris, Mike Nichols, Elaine May, a lot of the founding members of improv. When it was over, David went, all right, it's time to do my popular theater. And then they started Compass, which became enormously successful, but it wasn't a success David wanted. Again, he wanted steel workers to come up on stage and do scenes about their life. And instead, Compass became a magnet for intellectuals from the University of Chicago. And keeping in mind that this cast had some of the great talkers of the day, Mike Nichols, Elaine May, Shelley Berman. And what was happening was people were branching off. Nichols and May were doing their thing. Shelley Berman would do his telephone thing. And Compass kind of came to an end by 57. 2 years later, Paul Sills, Howard Hawk, and Bernie Salins wanted to come up with another coffee house type theater. They originally wanted to call it Compass, but David didn't want to sell them the copyright, so it became Second City. Even though David said he had nothing to do with Second City, he had quite a bit to do with it in the early days, providing scenarios, doing workshops. David actually, up until 62, 63, kept coming up with new versions of Compass. He had one in St. Louis that had Alan Arkin, Stiller and Mira, Nancy Ponder. Um, did one at Hyannisport, 63, with Alan Alda, Rennie Santoni, Diana Sands. David had a great ability to cast these shows, but he couldn't recreate that magic. They were all special, but still it wasn't his goal of getting the audience up and doing shows about their life. So for most of the 60s, David worked straight jobs, advertising, public relations. Uh, but in the late 60s, his marriage fell apart and he went back into improvisation. He created an organization called Community Makers, which was developing theater projects relevant to the communities, trying to heal communities using improv. And that's when David met Howard Jerome. And together they developed the Responsive Scene, which was first a stage show, then a radio show, and then the Improv Olympics.
mhm.
Um, but it continued with David still couldn't make money. And even though he kept getting invited to do workshops at university and theater companies, he still had to work some straight jobs well into the 80s.
Mm.
But he brought the Improv Olympics to Chicago in 81, and that just started a whole new movement with professional improvisers, amateurs. That's when he met Jonah. They worked together for a couple of years, then they went their separate direction. But the last 20 years of David's life, as he was still working a straight day job, but still pursuing his passion with improvisation, a good friend of his went, why don't you stop doing your formats with people who have no money? Go to where the money is. And David ended up in Belchertown, Western Massachusetts, Pioneer Valley, where his format movie experience, where he gets groups together to create their own video movie, um, people went nuts for it. And that provided him an income. And that's where David met his third wife, Nancy Fletcher, who felt this format is wonderful. I can do this with young women as an empowerment thing. So Act Now was inspired by movie experience. It's the same format, developing a movie through improvisation. The process is more important than the final product, but this one was meant just for young women. And so David, even though it was a big struggle financially and didn't become as successful as his peers, uh, he always did exactly what he wanted. And the last 20 years of his life was actually able to make a living exclusively from improv and starting to get some recognition for his work.
That's a great summary, but let's go now a little bit back. Okay, so let's go now through a few things, maybe a little bit more deeper.
Sure.
Um, where is the name Compass coming from?
Compass was a way of looking at the world, where we're going, where we came from. Um, it's as simple as that.
Mm.
Um, he always loved the name Compass. In fact, one of an artifact he had was a compass that his father had, which I hope a family member has that now. But it's a wonderful name, and yeah, sometimes it's known as Compass Cabaret, Compass Players, but it's as simple as just a way of looking at where we're going and where we came from. The element of time has always been very important to David. Um, in fact, his format Time Dash from the Improv Olympics is what I think really strengthened the Harold Del Close's format, which Shauna introduced to Del when they started working together.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because most of the improvisers who know a little bit of history of improv, they will know about Harold and their clothes, and that's the brand which is connected to their clothes. But originally, there were many people working with their clothes on that format, and as
Yeah.
you say, it was influenced by other stuff. So, do you know more details about how that worked in old times?
What I know is that the first version of the Harold appeared when Del was a performer with the committee.
Committee.
And the same concept was Dell was always saying there has to be a way to develop a full length play or a long piece through improvisation. Um, and the Harold was originally developed by the committee to address what was going on with the Vietnam War. And in fact, the name Harold, I don't think was coined by Dell. It was just a bunch of people thinking, well, what should we call this? And someone said, well, we just call it Harold. And it kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Um, for as long as from the moment I met David and then Dell became part of that world, it was always, he has this idea for developing a play to improvisation. And I must have been hearing it for like 20 years. Um, but it seemed like finally, working with Schoner is what brought it to the forefront. But I would think if you spoke to surviving members of the committee, you might find more information about that. I know there's this documentary in the process that's being put together that I've been hearing about for years about the committee because, I mean, aside from Dell, there are Carl Gottlieb, Dell Close, Howard Hessman, a lot of important people came out of the committee, which was very much politically motivated, which I it's part of David's work. His work is politically motivated too.
Hmm. So let's talk about the beginning of Improv Olympics, because also that's very often the story starts with Ayo and Sharna, but not many, or in Europe less people know about that. That it's not the beginning. The beginning is the influence of David Shepard and his
Howard Jerome.
idea. So can you tell me, because we already mentioned that in the same time there were few places where comedy sports, theater sports of Keith Johnston, everything rised in the same moment, apart few years maybe, independently, as probably as far as I know. So how David came up with the idea, what gave him the, and I think I read today about you that you were playing with your team, and he saw it, and he saw kind of like sportive sports ideas in your team, and he wanted to expand it. Can you?
Well, yeah, it's David originally came up with the Improv Olympics in 1972,
Mhm.
and he came up with the idea one Thanksgiving. He was with his in-laws. They feasted, and then they sat on the couch and watched football. And David felt they should be engaged in their own sport instead of being passive and just looking at people doing stuff. And then one afternoon, David and Howard Jerome were doing an improv workshop. They're kind of playing around with the idea of the Improv Olympics that how can we do this? And I believe it was Howard Jerome, who's kind of a former jock, went, well, why don't we just choose up teams? Let's choose up teams. So they decided to choose up teams, and that's how the competition developed. Just let's come up with the teams. And in the beginning, the Improv Olympic was just a series of who, what, where scenes. In the beginning, it was two quarters. The actors just play the second half. We get the audience in. Um, but then the thing about the Improv Olympics is, and it's indicative of David's work, David has this fantastic idea, and other people start adding things to it. So for about 2 years, we're doing the Olympics the way it was designed, who, what, where scenes, audience, regular actors, sometimes they would direct. But then they brought it up to Toronto. Homemade Theatre in Toronto was doing an improv festival, and they were invited up to premiere the Improv Olympics. But as they're working with the theater group, their take was, if this is called the Improv Olympics, let's make this more sports like. And that's when they came up with the idea of events like character relay, emotional hurdles, space jump, time dash. And all of those events actually came from directions the audience would give because we realized they're always wanting changing this and that. So each format should focus on that area. And then they came up with the oath and wearing referee outfits and bells and everything else. So that's how the events happened.
Mhm.
But when the Canadian Improv Games started doing the formats, they found them to be kind of difficult. There were too many of them, and they were trying to think, how could we just score these? So they took 11 events and just compressed it to five. I think it was story, style, character, life, theme. And when David took it to Chicago in '81, they went back to the events because he felt that's what the Olympics really were. He didn't want to simplify it. So began as a small idea in 72. The events were added in 74. The Canadian Improv Games started taking it to a different direction in 77. And then it became something totally different in Chicago, where I guess half was professional performers and the other half were the amateurs, the non-professionals. Uh, and that's, I think Chicago was, it came closest to what David wanted in terms of identity teams, that a team of firefighters could play a team of doctors, or a team of psychiatrists can play a team of nurses. And they had wonderful names like I think the psychiatrists were Freudian slippers. So yeah,
Did they have like a part of the name, other, how to say, if the team was doctors, did they also play like, you know, doctors plays? There was a language involved, or just the team because of clothes and just that?
it was the team. They would wear T-shirts with the names on
Okay.
it, but they would sometimes do scenes based on their reality. Because
Okay.
David's thing with identity teams is if it's going to be a team of doctors, well, I want to see what doctors do, how they hang out, how they talk.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes we would mix people up as well. Um, but yeah, it's and there's also problems with the name. I'm sure you heard the Olympic Committee,
Mm-hmm.
as they came after David first, and for a while we changed the name to Olympics, PIX. I still call it regular Improv Olympics. If the Olympic Committee wants to come for me, come for me. Um, Originally the Canadian Improv Olympics, but what was interesting when the Olympic Committee approached my friend Willie Wiley, instead of saying, don't use the name, we would like a piece of your profits. I guess they saw that once a year there's a national festival at the National Arts Center, to which Willie replied, you want profits from my nonprofit organization. So we changed the name, and yeah, they came after Shauna, and then yeah, came up with IO. She was pretty pissed after she saw the documentary because she didn't realize that there's a history of the Olympic Committee going after David, which he failed to mention to her when they were doing the Improv Olympics in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So the origin of IO was Improv Olympics, right?
yes.
So how
But
did?
that,
Hmm?
but Shauna, when they had their falling out, Shauna didn't think there was enough money to be made just dealing with the non-professional aspect of the competitions, and she wanted to do pretty much her version, I guess, of Second City. I mean, it speaks a lot for Shauna as a producer and administrator because there was a time if you wanted to study improv, your only option was Second City, and then later on it became the Players Theater, Joe Forsberg's group, and then Shauna came up with the Improv Olympics. Became a great training ground.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you because you mentioned David had a lot of games which were part of the Improv Olympics, and also you said that Time Dash and another game were probably influenced on Harold. So,
Yeah,
um,
that's the space jump where you go to different locations.
mhm,
Um, just I think Time Dash and Space Jump are probably the two main ones that influence the Harold.
mhm,
There are other ones that I see organically are in some of the ways they play the format. Like there's work put where you're doing a physical activity, but you're talking about something else.
yeah,
So the activity is never related to the conversation.
mhm,
I'm sure they do some form of character relay, switching characters, emotional hurdles being I know some heralds will start the show by just focusing on an emotion, and based on the emotion, then the show begins. So,
So if you would like to make credits for some games which are made or developed by David, what would be the collection of games coming
ooh.
from David, or few of them at least that people know?
Well, here are the things with David's games. When you look at every one of them, you can see the influence of Spolin. The majority of David's games are Spolin based. In fact, as my throat gets dry, when he did the Improv Olympics in '81, there was a player's contract. It was different than the one we talked about earlier. But this player's contract said that the only way you can train for the Improv Olympics would be through Viola's games. So you basically had to sign an agreement that, yes, I'll get a copy of Improv for the theater and I'll train people to do that. Um, but some of the games I can think of that are uniquely David, tirades and endorsements. This is something we would do at the beginning of a workshop, so we can get a sense of what everyone is feeling. A tirade is something that pisses you off. An endorsement is something you're passionate about. And David would encourage people to do this like a soapbox rant, like standing on top of a box in the middle of a park. And sometimes the people who are listening might respond verbally, egging that person on. But tirades and endorsements, yeah, that's to me uniquely David. Um, the responsive scene, I think, is uniquely David, even though a who, what, where format is stolen, but sometimes in a different way. Um, Life play, David's last format, the repetition poem that I mentioned, is wonderful. Um, Towards the end, I started using a lot of David's games with my students as if I'm starting a conversation, with them not realizing we're now playing. Um, David's with David's games, he always feels there should be a close connection between player and a side coach to keep things on track, to keep things moving.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One wonderful game, which is a story game of David's, is called Zoom Story, where I would pitch to a player an opening line for a story, which could be a springboard, which is as simple as I looked out the window and I saw someone walking up my driveway. As you are telling me that story, I will constantly jump in with directions such as zoom in on an object, and you'll continue the story, but you're telling me about an object that's in that part of that story. Environment, what's going on around you. Action, what's happening. Feeling, what are you feeling? And after a while, all right, zoom into an ending. So it's a wonderful way to ease someone into um, doing improv without them realizing you're making up a story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even then, trying to get my students to come up with here's the example of a springboard line. Now let's go. Once upon a time. Okay, that doesn't accept once upon a time, and then
Mm-hmm.
go in there. Um,
Was the storytelling big part in it, like in the work of David? By
David, with stories, David would go approach it in different ways. Like as a warm up, he might put two people together and just take a minute, tell each other a short story about yourself.
mm-hmm.
And sometimes we would come back and we would all share what we heard from the other person. I just happen to have these on the side. Dave used to have these improvisation cards where we would warm people up, and they were broken down by time, emotion, character, story, and A perfect story example would be your car is skidding off the road.
Mm-hmm.
It's a minute later. What happened? Or you just won the lottery. It's the next day. Tell me what happened. Just
Mm-hmm.
we experiment with stories in a different way. With the event story throw, sometimes you would just come up with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Then we would play the scene. Other times, first line, second line, third line, then we would do it. Then there's story chorus, whether it's a group of people and you're conducting one word at a time, a few words at a time. But as around the 80s, David started exploring, as I mentioned before, myths and legends because he felt the only way we can understand where we are right now and where we're going in the future is to explore the classic stories from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, One example, which is uniquely David, is Jonah and the Whale. He developed an improv show through the Improv Olympic events. Once it was set, they set the dialogue, but it was developed through improv. And with Jonah and the Whale, David felt it's a metaphor for you could be devoured by a relationship, you could be devoured by your job. Let's explore that in the contemporary setting. Let's see what that would be like in a time dash or a character relay. Um, and yeah, that was called the Jonah complex.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we actually explored Don Juan, but in the contemporary setting called Donna Juanita. So it was a female Lothario.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, David, again, as I mentioned, his classical resources, the vast library in his head. And again, God forbid if I ever said, well, yeah, I'm familiar with Jonah and the Whale, but I never read anything about it. What do they teach you in your public school? You say, I'm sorry, I'll read about Jonah and the Whale and see how that goes.
Was David side coaching while he was teaching?
Frequently, it could be just very brief. It could be as simple as louder because he couldn't hear you, or you might hear him go explore the where for 30 seconds. Um, Actually, yeah, David's side coaching usually had about five specific things. Sometimes he would say, do lone wolf. I have a feeling this might be a spelling game. Lone wolf is only one person can move and speak at a time. So if you're suddenly on stage with three other people and David goes lone wolf, all your movements become very specific. Another great David direction would be 5 second delay. That whenever you say something to the other player, that player has to wait 5 seconds before they respond to you. And that's something he would really be on top of because 5 seconds is actually a lot longer than you think it is, and people would rush through it, and David would jump in with 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. There you go, fine. Um, Gibberish was always very big for David, so if he felt that you were talking too much or there was no emotional sincerity, he would just go out, do gibberish. Uh, David's side coaching was always focusing on a specific improv skill.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be times let's just focus on the object, on the activity, or as I mentioned before, drinking a sour cup of coffee, and then all right, let's take some time. What is that like? How's that affecting your body?
Mm-hmm.
If you were just going to get on stage and just talk, yeah, David would be all over you in a second. Um, Although David also had interesting games that had no preparation, but you really had to listen. Um, it's called Four-Sided Ware. And to me, this is a uniquely David game. And I've done it with professional improvisers who afterwards have gone to me, that was hard. Where two actors come on stage, and together you have to create the four sides of the stage. So one person will go, okay, downstage, window to a fire escape. Other one to the right. Okay, there's a couple of logs over here. On the right, there's a kitchen sink. Behind you is a trap door. That's all you need to know. Go into the scene utilizing those four areas. And that's pretty difficult. I've had to cut it down for some of my students because they can't remember. All right, three-sided where, and sometimes, all right, just two. But with David, yeah. In fact, he even went as far as six sides once, which was the four sides and then center stage and looking up to the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
But
What?
just
Yep.
but trying to remember all that was daunting.
Yeah. Was the living newspaper format of David, or was also like from Viola or somewhere else?
The living newspaper was actually David's creation, although a lot of people think it was inspired by the WPA project, the Works Progress Administration, where in the 30s and early 40s, theater was funded by the government. And that was to do shows about American life. But it was like a living theater production about housing, a living theater production about unemployment. Those were full length plays. David's concept of the living newspaper, it was a curtain raiser before a compass, where David would take a newspaper clipping and some of the actors would do a tableau of the picture. One person might narrate the text. Some people might actually do dialogue if there's dialogue in the article. And what David would do that morning is they would get all the newspapers, clip through them, find one that they think would be a good living newspaper, and sit there and go, all right, Michael, you're going to do the opening. Barbara, you're going to do this pose. You're going to do that. So it was very short, very brief, but it was a curtain raiser. It was not full length, as some people think, from the WPA project.
Mm-hmm.
And David told me years later he never heard of the living newspaper from the WPA project. It was just something they came up with. In fact, a constant in David's creativity is sometimes he would come up with a title for something, but then had no idea how he's going to go about and do it. So I remember some original Compass members told me David would come up and go, I have this idea for Compass. It's going to be based on this. And I want to open the show with the living newspaper. And of course, well, what's a living newspaper? I don't know yet. So literally, it's bringing a newspaper article to life, which brings me back to another David format, which is also uniquely David. Although I've heard other people have done this, where David would bring in different magazines and newspapers, and the workshop participants would go through them, but then they would pick a picture that meant something to them emotionally. And you can either tell a story about it, or maybe a poem or a song. Maybe you want to do a scene based on it. And to this day, I still have not been able to pull it off with my students.
I wanted to ask you about one thing. As we mentioned, that a lot of things like comedy sports and theater sports and Improv Olympics grew more or less in the same time and were developed in the same time. I think I heard somewhere you saying that when that you and David saw the theater sports of
Uh,
Keith Johnston together, and you had some kind of um, you described that in a way that it was different of from Improv Olympics. So, what was the difference for you?
well, I've learned since I saw that production in '79. I saw this production before I read Keith's book,
Hmm.
but the competitive improv formats I've always been familiar with are we're doing scenes and the actors are just competing and I'm being judged on teamwork, sincerity of emotion, doing the story, the character. But what David and I saw seemed to be more verbally based games, and the outcome seemed to be focused on the performers screwing up and then being mocked.
Mhm.
Like I said, one performer screwed up in the scene and had to wear a dunce cap for the remainder of it. Um, David and Keith did talk afterwards. I wasn't part of that conversation, but they seemed to understand each other. Although when I read Keith's book, it was kind of light years from what I saw on stage because the chapter that really resonated with me was the one on status and working with masks. Um, and I didn't see any of that. Um, but it seems like theater sports, like the Improv Olympics, it's based on who is doing it at that time and what their approach is. Um, because I spoke to this improviser, his name is Alistair Cook. He was actually Keith was his mentor, and he's still very close with him. And he told me that yeah, what theater sports, what you saw, that wasn't the original intention. That yeah, there were scenes based on status and masks and being in a moment. So I was actually a judge for several theater sports matches in New York during the 80s, and they seemed to be more scene based. There was one format which I use sometimes called Status Switch, where you come up with a status relationship. And during the course of the scene, you have to switch, not the characters, but whoever had high status is now low and vice versa. And that I enjoyed. To me, that, all right, if that's what theater sports is, that's okay. And I think the difference there is it was performed for a theater audience, and the version Dave and I saw in Toronto, I think it was exclusively comedy. That was there wasn't going to be any sincere emotion or
Mhm.
reality playing in what we saw.
Do you have
Um,
any special quotes from David which you remember and like?
yes. Uh, oh yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, I opened the box of Pandora.
Well, I one quote of his which became famous because it was from a question, but it was such a wonderful response that I gave it to my friend Pam Victor, who did a book called Improv, Fast and the Speed of Light. Because I asked David, what's the difference between acting and improvisation? And David thought for a second and went, "Eh, acting is memorization. Improvisation is life." So that's pretty direct. You know, acting is memorization, improv is life. Another one of his, which, and this is usually when people are giving him all kinds of excuses why they can't do improv, why they don't have time. And his was always, just do it. It's as simple as that. Just do it.
Hmm.
Um, but we, as early as my teenage group, we were always impersonating David because David had little catchphrases like "That was intense, baby." So sometimes during Improv Olympic rehearsals, I think imagine there's a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds would suddenly go, "Let's all be David," and we're all like talking like David. Um,
That's. And I wanted to ask you about like, what's the difference between comedy and satire, or how you see the subject? You know, because as we know, we all do uh, improv, which is a comedy-based thing, but sometimes we say don't try to be funny. So what's funny, or what was David's approach and what is your approach, and what's the comedy? Where is comedy?
well, well, with another catchphrase of David's was always "Be real, be real." As simple as that. Compass, even though it became known as being a comedy showcase, it was, yeah, dry mouth. I'm talking about. It was always It was always about satire. That was the original focus of Compass. If there was going to be humor, it had to be through the reality of the situation, the reality of the circumstance, the reality of the character. So
Mhm.
David was not opposed to humor, but he did not like jokes. And that was probably his aversion to Second City because Paul used to tell him if in an improv scene at Second City, you're not getting a laugh every 15 to 30 seconds, you're not getting over. And David did not like that focus. But, that said, not many people are aware of this, but David had David had to be one of the funniest people I've ever met. There was a very funny side to David, and there were times when he could be Captain Shtick. This is my one of my favorite David stories. When I first came back to New York City, I was with this theater group, and we decided to do an outdoor fundraiser on the NYU campus. But we decided to do the Improv Olympics, and David lived around the corner from NYU. So he wakes up one morning and he can hear outside the window my voice on a loudspeaker. Welcome to the Improv Olympics. This is your show. Give us your suggestions and we'll do a scene. So David was just thrilled. He ran down there and we were on this plaza. So I go, oh, David Shepard's here, the creator of the Improv Olympics. Let's do a scene. So the scene suggestion was father and son getting ready. The son is about to get married. Perfect. I played thousands of father son scenes with David. Every line that came out of David's mouth was a one liner. And it was hysterical. The audience was going nuts, and I couldn't believe it. And at one point, I was thinking to myself, so this is the way we're going to play this? All right. So I started responding with jokey one liners, and that's what the scene was. And afterwards, I went to David, what the hell was that? I just felt like doing it.
But that brings me to another question. Was David a performer, or he was like just more a teacher and not performing much?
David was in the beginning at Playwrights and Compass. He was a reluctant performer. Um, from members of Playwrights and Compass, they've told me, not a great performer, but I have seen David do some amazing improvisations. He did not have a lot of confidence in his own improv abilities, mostly because look at who he was surrounded by. He could never be as quick as Mike Nichols or as insightful as Elaine May. But I've read reviews of publications from Playwrights Theater Club where David was singled out for some performances. I can say when David and I have played together or in small workshops, he's wonderful. When he has gone on stage, yeah, he gets pushed into Captain Shtick land. And I think it's, as you know, there's a huge difference between improvising in the comfort of a closed workshop and going on stage and having people look at you. I don't know which person said this. It could have been Dell that you lose like a third of your intelligence once you go on stage. So,
Oh, that's a great one.
but I have done some wonderful improvisations with David, either in the Improv Olympics or alone. We had this thing where whenever David was in Ottawa for the Improv Olympics, and it's me, David, Willie, and Howard, after the show, we would go up to one of our hotel rooms and we would just play until like sunrise.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, not a lot of confidence in his own. I think he would consider himself an improv director, improv teacher. I think, yeah, I think that's how he would like to have been known.
Hmm.
Uh, I know that the Improv Olympics, even though Compass is what he's primarily known for, the Improv Olympics is something that he was most proud of. I think it's because of the people he connected with through that format. Um, I actually told a close friend of mine once when David's end was near. She was asking me, "So, what do you think you're going to miss the most when David's gone?" And his ability to connect me with the most interesting people who have become important parts of my life. Although I realize now that he's been gone for almost, 2.5 years, I'm still being connected to people because of him. I mean, he's not here, but because of his work. I mean, I'm talking to you about his work. I don't think we would have had this discussion if not for David. So, yeah, it's I like to think I'm comfortable in my own skin with my own work and have no problem saying, yeah, I was David's wingman. I'm his protege. I'm
I owe
proud.
him now this too because I got to meet you.
I wish you could have met David.
Yes. But I meet him through you, and I think that's really wonderful that I had that chance talking to you with all this. And I think again, like with many of my guests, I could talk another
Oh
12 hours,
my God.
but we already talked 2 hours. So I have like just wrapping up uh, quickly. I would like to ask you, like, if you had an advice for an improviser, let's say for young improvisers, for teenagers, what would that be?
Be as well informed as possible. Read everything. Be on top of current events. Go into areas that you normally would not go into because everything you learn, the more knowledge you have as a person, makes you a better improviser.
Yay, that's great. Then it's another one. When last time, now I have a
Yeah.
dry throat. When last time did you do something for the first time, which is not improv? And this talk.
Oh, that's not improv and not this talk. Something I've done for the first time. Oh wow. Wow, that's it's amazing how improv has invaded every aspect of my
Right.
life. Because the first thing I wanted to say was, no, that's improv. Um, well, it's kind of improv, but I work with a group of people afflicted with aphasia, and that's people have problems speaking. It's usually people who are stroke victims, head trauma.
Mhm.
Um, there's actually 7 different types of aphasia too. Some are high functioning, some can't read words, some can hear a word but can't get it back to you. Well, I've been doing theater workshops
Mhm.
with them, and it's a group I've never worked with before. So I found myself having to do research so I can be sort of prepared, but being more open to the moment. So I guess it's still improv, but
Yeah. Yeah,
my
I meant in the sense that not like, new scene, playing the new scene, improv scene or something, because always new, but like an event. That's a great answer.
I mean, in a way, the past year I've become, I guess, more isolated in a way. Although things like this and a lot of different Zoom conferences I jump in on, it's taking me out of that. Um, but wow, I'm going to be thinking about that. Something I did for the first time, but that's not improv. Wow, I don't know. That's like a
That's why I like to ask this question because it's interesting how we what we do a part of our improv life. So this is the very, very last question. Why do you love improvisation?
Um, because it gives me a sense of family that I thought I lost living out here. Um, and a lot of that is because of Jeff and the Fanatic Salon that I find whenever I talk to a fellow improviser, even if I don't know that person and I may be a little intimidated by them because they could be well known, once we start talking about the work, it's as if we've known each other forever. And all that sense of anxiety I have over, oh my God, I'm talking to Paul Dooley or Paul Sands or Ed Asner, just goes right out the window. So, and it makes me miss David less. I think what drew me to improvisation, and I had to think about this for a while. I always thought what drew me to improvisation in the beginning was, well, it gave me an opportunity to do whatever I wanted to do. I mean, what 14-year-old would not want to write, direct, act their own stuff? But I realized the importance of it was the sense of community. When I think of my closest friends, they're all from the world of improv.
Mhm.
And it's when this happened twice to me. When I gave the eulogy for Willie Wiley at his memorial, when I was up there at the podium, when I was looking out at the audience, I was looking at 40 years of Canadian improvisers, and I realized I'm looking out at an important part of my life. And when I was giving a eulogy for David's memorial, it was yeah, there's my life out there with 40 people who are important to me. So it's just, yeah, I think as long as I do improv, I'm not really totally alone. Um, but yeah, and I guess in a way with David, some have said because, David was an only child and he was raised by servants and he wanted a family. So in some ways, I guess you could say David's quest for improv was finding that next family. And yeah, I don't know what I would have done if I didn't hook up with all these vast improvisers out here in LA that I didn't know existed until after I finished working on David's archives. So yeah, yeah. And as
Hey,
you know, we all help each other out. I mean, Jeff, you should be interviewed by Monica. I told Jeff you should be interviewed by Margot Escott, and it's
yes,
although we also all feed off each other too. So
true. Michael, thank you so much for this lovely, very long talk, but absolutely interesting. Thank you so much for being my guest, and thank you so much.
oh, thank you. This was a blur. I just whoosh.
Yes, it was.
Well, this is great. I had a wonderful time. All right.
Thank you so much. Okay.